Hi, this is Kevin, and today I'm with my colleague Paul Elliott. Paul is the author of the Fabrication Gem, and today I'm inviting him to talk about his guidelines of using Fabrication Gem. Hi, Paul.
Hey.
So, Paul, tell us a little bit about the Fabrication Gem.
Well, Fabrication is a library that generates objects for your test environment or for maybe a database seed or populate file. It's actively tested against Active Record, Mongoid, SQL, and Data Mapper, and allows you to create regular Ruby objects that aren't backed by a database. Pretty much anything. You would want to use it so that you can define a schematic. If you have to generate an object a whole bunch of times, and maybe it's got a bunch of required fields that you don't care about a lot of the time, you would define all of that in the Fabricator, so you can always at any time say fabricate user, for example, and that will always give me a valid user persistent to the database.
So it's an object generation tool. I can see this really valuable when I write tests. Is that right?
Absolutely, yeah. It's meant to be used in a test environment like RSpec or Cucumber.
Okay, let's look at some code, and maybe you can walk us through some fabrication object generation tests.
So we're looking here at a repo called Lunch Bunch, which is a Rails application that one of our apprentices here at Hashrocket made a while back. So the purpose of Lunch Bunch, the app, is to allow you to go and say, I'm going this place for lunch, and it's publicly known, so if anyone wants to join you, they can go right on here and say, hey, I want to go there too, and I will go with you at that time and see you there, or go with you, what have you. So it's got restaurants, outings, and users, I think, are the only three models. It's a pretty simple application. So let's take a look at the code. So this is the restaurant spec. So when you're making a Fabricator, one of the really cool things that Fabrication will let you do is use the block syntax at fabricate time. Normally, like if you were using Factory Girl or another library, they would only support that when you're defining the factory. You couldn't actually generate something with the block. And that's really cool when you have a long list of attributes, because this is much more readable than if I just had a big hash in here, like street, blah 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 blah. Right, we don't want to do that. Right. So this is pretty good, and as you see, what they've done here is they're testing the address method. This isn't quite how I would have written it, but it's perfectly fine. So they're saying the address should be the street, the city, and the state, all concatenated with commas. Now, as you can see, all of that data is in here. The only thing that they're really doing wrong, in my opinion, is they've got the name. Now, this name isn't down in here at all. I don't really care about that. Right. Sure, it's probably required to make the restaurant. Validates uniqueness of name. Actually, yeah, so you have to have a unique name. That's all well and good. But we don't actually care about the name for the test, so that should not be in here.
Okay.
That's the reason that you would use something like Fabrication, so that in your tests, you can fabricate it, specify the things you actually care about for this particular example, and ignore everything else. Even if it's required, it'll generate it automatically. That's fine. You're overriding with these things here. So the only things that are on the screen right now are things I actually care about for testing the address method.
Right. Okay, I can see that's a really powerful feature, because if I have 5 attributes that are required and I'm doing tests, I don't want to just do create object and put at 5 attributes every time. So this actually saves me a lot of effort doing that.
It does, and also you've got this schematic, so as your object changes over time, you add more required fields. If you weren't using something like this, you would have to go and update everywhere you're building one of these when you add a required field. Right. This way you just say, add it to the Fabricator, and then everything still works. Okay. You haven't broken anything.
Maybe you can show us the Fabricator?
Sure. This is the Fabricator for that. I normally, especially when we're validating uniqueness, I wouldn't use a hard-coded string like that. This is all good. I would probably instead, I would definitely use Faker.
Okay, so Faker.
You can do like company name.
So that's Faker is just a library that gives you some fake names.
Yeah, it generates all kinds of fake data. You can make lorem, and there's company BS. There's a lot of fun stuff in there. The gem is actually ffaker. That's the one you want to use. It's the one that's currently maintained.
Okay. Okay.
So as you can see, the fabricators are pretty simple. There's a lot of cool stuff you can do in here. that this particular fabricator doesn't need. But generally, this is what you would have, is a bunch of blocks, and a block will be evaluated every time you fabricate. If I used, like I had before, what I had before with this, that deli cone will be evaluated when the fabricator is defined. So obviously that's not going to be dynamically generated every time. If you were to do this without that, now your company name will be generated once by Figure when it processes the fabricator when the system starts up. Not what you want. Always make sure you use those. That trips some people up sometimes.
Okay. Let's see what to say
and
next.
kind of as an aside, there's some other changes you could make to this, I think, to make it a little more readable. Like for one, we want to specify the subject because that tells us what we're actually testing. So restaurant dot what is it? Address. Right, and now down here we can say just it should equal that. Whoops.
Right. Yeah, I like that. So it's pretty clear what we're testing here.
Yeah.
Okay.
It tightens it up a little bit, and it also gives you better output because it'll actually say restaurant address should equal that. It just reads better in the RSpec output when you do it this way. I always like to, at the very first line of a describe, put the subject, and that way we know exactly what's being tested.
Okay.
When it makes sense.
Yep.
So let's look at something a little more complicated.
So
one thing that I don't like about this, about the way this test is done, is the event date isn't specified here. It's obviously something we care about. I don't know what this date's going to be when I look at this test. I mean, it could be anything.
Right.
It could be in the past, it could be in the future. Maybe it's randomly generated. I mean, who knows? Maybe it's today. It doesn't say that in the outing. So let's take a look at the fabricator and see. Date.today. Now, this is what I was talking about earlier, where this date.today is going to be evaluated when RSpec boots up. Not every time you generate something, which is probably fine because today is only going to change in the middle of your test if you run it at midnight and it takes a few seconds.
Right.
But as a general rule, I would surround that with quotes. Now, let's see what's even required. Validates unique today on create, presence of restaurant ID. What is unique today? No.
Event date. It's not required.
It's not required. So event date's not a required field. And neither is event time. As a general rule, for a base fabricator, I wouldn't put anything on here that isn't required.
Okay.
So if you're not validating that event date and time have to be there, I wouldn't include it. Also, this bank syntax is no longer supported. In the old version of Fabrication, it had a feature where it would lazily generate things. Fabrication 2 doesn't do that.
Okay.
So if you have any bangs, if you were using 1.0, you need to remove those, and it'll tell you when you try and upgrade.
So in this fabricator, there's a restaurant and user. What do they mean?
So what'll happen here, since these are belongs to,
Yes, we can say
there belongs to
outing.
association. So what this does internally is it'll say fabricate restaurant. Right. And same for this, it'll fabricate a user. It'll expand out to just this automatically.
Okay.
And what that'll do is persist when it goes to build an outing, when it gets to generate the restaurant, it'll actually persist a restaurant and then set that on the outing that it's creating. Now, if you wanted to also make users, then you could say like count 3 or count 2, right?
So that would give you
Now,
2 users.
What that's going to expand to is something like this.
Oh, very nice. What is fabricate build?
So when you say fabricate outing, for example, that's actually going to go and persist the outing to the database.
Okay.
When you say .build, it will create a new one, but it's not going to call save. And it knows how all the ORMs work, so it knows the right way to save all these things.
I see. Just like active record, you can do build.
Exactly.
Without saving it. Okay.
Exactly.
I see.
Now, by default, what Fabrication will do, one of the goals of the library is just to work the way you would expect, especially with regards to associations, to let you sort of specify as little as possible and have it link everything up the right way.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why you should be able to do this, and all of that stuff should just work. Now, we're relying on the ORM to do a cascading save. So it's going to build to, in this case, it'll build the two users and not actually persist them. When save is called on the outing that's being generated, that save will cascade to those built users, and it'll save them at that point. And then all the IDs will be linked up properly.
Oh, okay. I see. So this works for Active Record, and you also mentioned works for Mongoid and
Active Record, Mongoid, SQL, Data Mapper are the
very
supported
nice.
ORMs, and it's actively tested against all of those. It tests against the latest version of all of those. So if you're using an old version of any of those ORMs, you use with care, because every version has a different set of bugs than the last, and sometimes things work and sometimes things don't.
Okay, so let's go back to the spec.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, so what I didn't like about these is that the event date isn't specified. So I don't really know. Now, one thing you could do is say like outing and then outing for today or something like that. You could make custom ones. Now, if you do that, then what you're going to have is, let's get rid of this noise. Outing for today from outing. And here,
Okay.
we're going to just override the methods, and forgive me, I don't remember what they are.
Event date.
There's event date and event time.
Event time.
So what we want to do here is say event time is 12 p.m. I think. That's what was in there before.
Mm-hmm.
And then event date is date today. So that way when we get an outing for today, it's very explicit. It says that the outing is today. And we may not even want the time on there. That may not be important. And that way in here, when we go to build these things, outing for today, it's very explicit. And that way we don't have to have the fully expanded thing everywhere. If it's something that we're going to be using a lot,
Mm-hmm.
definitely make custom fabricators for the different situations that you have.
Okay.
And then you can reuse all that setup, so you don't have to keep putting it again. Now, where the restaurant queue's being passed in, the reason that you do have to do that is because you want all these outings to be for the same restaurant, and if you don't specify that here, then they'll all be for different restaurants. So if I just use the restaurant that's automatically generated with an outing, each of the outings will be for a different restaurant.
Correct. Right, because in the fabricator, we're linking the outing to a restaurant, and that restaurant is fabricated.
Mm-hmm.
So every time we get an outing, it will be linked to a different restaurant.
Yeah.
So anything else you want to talk about with the code here?
No, just again, that whenever you're writing a test, you want to be explicit when you set it up. The data I care about should be in the setup. The data I care about should be in the specify or example blocks. So, make sure that it's only the things I actually care about, nothing more, nothing less.
Okay.
Otherwise, it's noise, or it's either going to be noise or magic. If you put too much in there, it's noise. If you don't specify everything that it's asserting on, then there's this magic. Like, where did these names come from? Where did these dates come
Correct.
from? It's, and that's just going to confuse developers down the road.
Correct. So maybe that's another reason you say you only want to have the required fields in the base fabricators instead of putting too much stuff in it.
Right. And when I make a fabricator, I often don't put anything into it at all until I actually run into a situation with a test where I can't persist something because the thing's missing. So let's say, for example, the restaurant requires a name, But in all of my tests, I'm specifying the name because I actually do care about it in my tests. I wouldn't put the name in the Fabricator. I wouldn't put it in there until I have a test. I've set up a test properly, and of course, I'm doing TDD here. Once I've set up a test and I've put in the things I care about, name is not part of that list. Once I don't care about name anymore, that's when it goes into the Fabricator. And that way I don't end up with bloat. Because the more lines you put in the Fabricator, that's more things that it has to process every single time you fabricate something. Right. So you don't want anything in there that doesn't absolutely have to be in there.
Right. The other thing I heard about fabrication is it has Cucumber integration. Can you show us something about that?
It does. So fabrication ships with Cucumber steps. And there's basically 3 different ones that you would care about. There's given the following user. And you would use this if you want to make a single user record. You could also say given the following users with a colon.
Okay.
And then you say name and email and Joe and blah, blah, blah.
Okay, so that's just a Cucumber table and...
It's regular old Cucumber table.
Okay.
And you would use the plural and the headers across the top if you want to make multiple records. If you want to make one, then the header goes down the side.
Ah, I see.
Like that.
Okay.
So
the first one just give you one user,
right.
And the second one give you multiple users.
Right. And so both of these are really useful, and this will match to any fabricator that you have defined. And the other really cool thing is you can do this. So we've generated a restaurant, and now fabrication is aware of this restaurant that we generated. Internally, it keeps track of that when you use these steps. Now we say that restaurant has the following outing. So what this is doing under the covers is saying fabricate outing with restaurant, the one that we just generated, plus user ID 1. That's what happens underneath, and then it stores that outing again internally. So these are really powerful. They allow you to set up the same way you do in the specs. You're setting up the data you care about, only the fields you care about, and linking them up as need be. And then you can go and use them in your assertions. Now, there's a few ways that we could improve what's being done here. For starters, specifying the ID of the user is not a good idea. That's really error prone, and it may or may not even work depending on what your ORM is and what version it is. Right. So there's a much better way we can do this, right? We maybe care about the email. We may care about it only in as much as that we're going to use it to link to the restaurant down below. Now, what's weird about this outing is that it has 2 different belongs to's, and as you can see, the way this Cucumber step is worded, you can only belong to one record when you specify.
Right.
But fabrication also ships with this really cool feature called transforms. If you go to fabricationgem.org, then click on the Cucumber steps and scroll on down to the bottom, and you will see a little explanation of the transforms. Here's an example of one right here, and how you would use them. You can also define them per model, but a lot of times we just define them per field. They're really cool, really powerful, and they're very different from the way Cucumber transforms work. They're a lot more robust than the Cucumber transforms. I prefer the fabrication ones over the Cucumber ones, and not just because I wrote the library, because I think they're considerably better. So what that allows us to do is, let's say that this is joe at example.com, right? And the reason we're specifying this email is because we're going to care about it, even though it's not down here in the assertions. We care about it because instead of saying user ID here, we're just going to say user. And then we're going to put in that user, that we filled in up here. Now what's going to happen is we're going to go and specify a transform, and this is not where you would specify it. You would specify this in like a step folder. I'm just going to put it here so we can see it.
Sure.
So you say what field it's going to be on, and then you make a lambda. And the lambda gets passed whatever was put into the table for that field. Now what we're going to do is user.find by email. Now, anywhere, because we defined this just on the user field, Anywhere in the application where I say user in one of these tables, it's going to assume that that was an email address. You would never put user in a table because that's always going to refer to an object.
I see.
So this way we can say user is this guy. Anybody reading this would be like, well, obviously it's this guy. It's this user that we're setting on here. And what the transform is going to do is run this lambda. It's going to pass the email into there. The user is going to be looked up, and it's going to return the user. Then when it builds the object, it's using that user model it pulled back from the database instead of the email that you entered. So this is a really, really powerful feature and allows you to write steps like this, which...
Yeah, I can see this as really powerful. For example, in more complex cases where you need to set up multiple users, you have super admins, you have some administrators and some common users. Then you can say this restaurant has the first two users, and the other restaurant has number 3 and number 4 users, and so on. And you can just distinguish them by user emails.
Yeah, there's a lot of things you can do with this too. You can I know there's been times when let's say I want to make an outing, and the following outing, right? And in the outing I have a happens apps. I know that's not the field, but we'll pretend it is. So let's say it was 2 weeks ago, right? That's cool. Now this is a date time field in the database. I'm going to say that outing was 2 weeks ago, and I'm going to make a transform. Fabrication transform define happens at time string. So what we're going to do is we're going to use something like chronic to parse it.
Yes.
Now I have an actual date time. It's relative. What's really awesome about this is that now I don't have to use timecop.
Correct.
Or any library like that. I don't care about stubbing at the time. When I have these things that are relative to each other, I can set them up in my test as relative to when the test is run, and it's very readable, much more so than having happens at oops, that's not a date.
Yes.
This is all well and good, but when you have a bunch of these, it gets really, really hard to read through the test. 2 weeks ago, anybody can look at that and say, oh, I know exactly what that is. Exactly. And chronic is very flexible. You can say like 2 weeks ago at 11:34 p.m. or something like that. So it allows you to make your tests a lot more readable, get them a little bit farther away from the metal. The transforms are one of my favorite features of Fabrication. They're really, really exciting and have helped me write much, much better Cucumber features.
Yeah.
They're also available for Turnip.
Oh, okay. You mean Fabrication supports Turnip?
Yes, there's fabrication steps for Turnip as well as Cucumber.
Okay.
So if you're using Turnip, you can. There's another rake task that'll install those, and it has all the same things that the Cucumber steps have.
Okay. So out of box, Fabrication supports these 4 ORMs you talked about. You mentioned like the records and Mongoloid and SQL and
Data mapper.
Data mapper.
And it'll support any object, and anything that has a save method. By default, when you say fabricate, it'll look and see if it has a save method, then it'll call it. And if you do fabricate build, then it won't. So even if you had some other maybe custom thing that wasn't actually one of those ORM back models, but it did have some method of persistence, maybe it sends off to an API or something, as long as it has a save method, Fabrication will call it and let it do whatever it does on save. Okay,
that sounds very nice. I know this really popular gem called Factory Grow, and so why do you want to use Fabrication over Factory Grow?
Well, Fabrication has no gem dependencies at all. It'll run on its own. If you're just in regular old IRB, you can require Fabrication and everything will just work, which is nice.
Oh, okay.
For some people, especially if you're using like Sinatra, you don't have active support. A lot of things depend on active support, or whatever the situation is. You can just fire this up and it works. It's got some nice syntax, I think. I really like the way that associations are defined. Of course, it has the transforms that we talked about in the Cucumber steps. Those are really, really handy. And the fact that it's tested against the different ORMs, I'm guaranteeing that it will work properly with those RMs. So you don't have to worry about that. I've already done the hard work of working around their bugs, at least in the most recent versions of each of those. So a lot of these are stylistic. Like when I say I like the way that it generates embedder. Factory Girl is a great library, and if you're comfortable using it, then that's wonderful, and you should. Fabrications, it works a little bit differently. It has some really cool features that Factory Girl doesn't have. Factory Girl has some awesome features that Fabrication doesn't have. The things I'm going for with the library is it should be fast, it should be simple, and it should just work. I want to make it as easy for as many people to use as possible without having to worry about all these different syntax supports and different ways you can specify the same thing. It's very consistent between defining a fabricator and actually fabricating something. The whole API is very consistent, very easy to use.
Okay. So speaking of the library, are you actively maintaining it?
Yeah, I'm actively maintaining it. I am on top of the issues. There's a mailing list. Of course, we have the doc site, and so you open an issue, and I will probably get back to you same day.
If anybody wants to contribute, how do you want them to do so?
Fork it on GitHub, and make sure there's specs. If there's no specs, I will tell you to add specs, and I will not accept a pull request that does not have specs.
Okay.
So.
Well, thank you, Paul. Thank you for talking to us today.
All right. Thank you.